In the name of the one and only, I welcome you to the program again, actually the continuation of the topic we discussed in the previous session, which is titled When the Prophet of Peace Meets the Prophet of War. And obviously the Prophet of Peace is spelled with a PH and the Prophet of War is spelled with an F. So same sound, different effects and different consequences, obviously. But in essence, we are going to be discussing that this is going to be an analysis or a continuation of the discussion on the analysis of the hubris syndrome in governance. The arrogance, the way where individual rulers, even if democratically elected, eventually becomes authoritarian, dictatorial, absolutists, and totalitarian. And of course, each one of those terms imply a different type, but we will deal with the generalities that sort of tie, that's the thread that runs through those features and characteristics of leaders. That's the hubris syndrome. To do a quick review, in the last session we discussed the difference between peace and war, not as a slogan, but as an ideal. That the ideal is peace, whereas we often resort to war in almost all human societies, and we discussed why that is. And I think the conclusion was that it's generally because war is glorified and it is attached and linked to concepts of securities and liberties, whether they are individual, tribal, national, ethnic, or otherwise. And so therefore there is an appeal made to the human survival in the name of security, and that's how humans are lured into accepting war, violence, killing, and very, very cruel behavior, so that they may achieve peace. And they get to peace only as an intermediary stage so they can prepare for another war. We also discussed as to why this kind of mindset may have evolved historically, that leaders, whether tribal leaders in the earlier human history or political leaders within different forms of polities, be they a tribal structure, a national or state, or an imperial structure, as to why would the people go along, or how are the leader able to manipulate sentimentalities and thoughts, and how they might exploit insecurities or create senses of insecurities in the people, and then exploit them in order for themselves to become, in the minds or in the eyes of the public, as indispensable, so that for their own security they hang on and hold on to the leaders, or accept their monopoly of power, or on power rather. We also discussed the actual definition of the Huber syndrome as to how it evolves, and I think the conclusion we drew was that it takes about 6 years altogether, that people eventually develop the hubris syndrome, that people who have stayed in political life and in political office, especially at the higher echelons of the political structure, that if they have worked long years, they may have developed the hubris syndrome long before they take command and charge of the highest office in a polity. However, people who have not had such experience may not develop it enough that it will affect them. And we give examples of great leaders, such as, if I remember correctly, Lech Walesa and Václav Havel and Nelson Mandela and a few others who have not had the experience at the higher echelons of a government, so that their sense or vulnerability to hubris syndrome had not developed, and therefore when their terms of office ended, they simply left the office and became citizens of their own countries, without claiming to be indispensable, without claiming or without trying to monopolize power, without trying to linger their terms of office or make excuses for them or any such thing. And so therefore they remain as the shining stars, the very few shining stars in human history, where they have governed without the power getting to their head. Rather, they were able to keep the power in their hands as the law required, but not to get to their heads, so that their emotions would get involved with them. We also discussed cases of other leaders, such as Vladimir Putin and Recep Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey, among many others, of course, who, after the approximately 6 or 7 years of their term of office, they were affected by the hubris syndrome and wanted to remain in power and try to play some kind of a musical chairs of changing titles but not giving up on power. Whether they were prime ministers or presidents, it didn't matter, but they were the center of power and they wanted to keep that. We also talked about Robert Mugabe, and of course these three names that I mentioned have had different backgrounds, or how they got to power as heads of a revolutionary movement or a reform movement, or simply appointed but the point is that the power got from their hand to their heads, and they wanted to cling on to them. We also talked about dynastic rulerships, and the examples we shared were those of the Kim dynasty in North Korea, Gaddafi in Libya, and the Assads in Syria, which again defies the concept and definition of whether an absolute rulership should be named as kingdom or empire, or use a more modern terminology such as president, but these presidencies are so hereditary that it makes a mockery of the concept, or rather of the label. In reality, they do become kings and absolute monarchs of sorts with, of course, politically correct titles. Today we want to continue that same discussion, and in the continuation of that, we want to discuss that the term of office may not necessarily have been long enough in some cases, but there are sometimes warmongering agenda that are used as tactics for them to make themselves indispensable, and that in itself may be an indication of a pathological disorder. So there is an emotional, psychological dimension to this, as well as the psychological, in the sense that if they play on people's emotion and appeal to their nationalistic fervor, for example, or to their religious fervor, or zealotry for that matter, that the rulers who want to stay in power, sometimes they use concept of psychology, or at least as far as their emotional attachment, or the emotional attachment of the people is concerned, and therefore they use ideas or ideologies for that matter. Then the other element is the pathological disorder, which is that they may not be aware of the condition they have themselves, and what may appear to them normal may not be normal in the public eye, but somehow the machine, and here I may borrow the term Rage Against the Machine, the name of a band that was in a sense advocating the control and centrality of political power and how it affects humans' life. So the machine is programmed to catapult certain individuals that serve the purpose of the hands behind the curtain. That some individuals may be no more than just puppets. So that this is a puppeteer. It's a game. A scene is created, but the real power behind the scene that makes the puppets move would allow for that. Now, in the process, of course, the actual leaders themselves, of course, becomes in a way victims of this. But in the long run, it's this pathological behavior manipulated from behind the scene, from which the world suffers. We had a good example in the Bush and Blair combination in the 2002 and 2003 in the prelude to the involvement in Iraq, which was a good example that they manipulated the fears of the people that they themselves created uh, all the concepts of the weapons of mass destruction and the weapons of mass deception that came to a head-on collision. And then the pathological disorder was such that their own emotional insecurities were projected upon not just the United States and Britain, but in a sense, in a matter-of-fact way, upon the whole world community, as the whole world was, in essence, dragged into the Middle Eastern quagmire. And the competitive warmongering agenda of Israeli politicians is another example, for instance, that in order for them to show that they are, to use this term, strong on defense, or the defense of the state of Israel, or terms like they are not going to negotiate with the terrorists, and so on, that these terminologies are used basically as campaign slogans. So every time there is an election in Israel, either the Palestinians, the Lebanese, or some other neighbors of Israel would have to pay the price so that these political campaigners can manifest their wrath and anger by either invading Lebanon or the Gaza Strip or some part in the West Bank, so that they would appear to be strong on defense and therefore deserving to be leaders of a nation that is under threat, under an existential threat, the way it's portrayed. It doesn't matter what the reality is. What matters is how the image is portrayed, presented, and implemented at the cost of the lives of many. And therefore, in a way, that too can help, if that's the right word, in the development of the hubris syndrome. As we can see, the Israeli leadership is, in a way, musical chairs. They take turns. They come back, second, third, fourth term as prime ministers, and every time they come back, they become. Every time they come back to power, they become even more ruthless. So there is that side of it, but all in all, there is a general characterization of the hubris syndrome that affects individuals. And as an individual, it may not matter, but as an individual with a lot of power and in the position of authority, and as they say, with their finger on the red button, this can become very, very risky proposition. And some of the concerns that have been raised lately, especially by the security apparatus in the United States, and those involved with the security of the United States through the CIA and other centers of political power in the United States, showing that a person with the characteristics of one of the candidates, namely Donald Trump, may not be a suitable person to be in the White House with that much power centered, and with him not having the stability and the foresight and the calculated assessment of a crisis, that a knee-jerk reaction might prove to be very disastrous, which is regardless of one's ideological affiliation or tendency. It's a justifiable argument that is being made. We have also seen signs of and symptoms of this psychopathic behavior, not only at the higher level of the government, but we have also seen them at the lower levels of the government and the military and the police. We see that they do study the PTSD effect on the U.S. Army returnees, that aside from the fact that 22 attempts are made it successfully or otherwise, attempts of suicide by the American soldiers who have returned. And at one level you could say that, yes, when they are exposed to such a trauma overseas, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria, and elsewhere, that the bar of normalcy, or that which is perceived and considered to be normal, is moved in a way where a lot of things that would normally be considered violent becomes normal for them. And so when they are resorting to violence, they don't see it as abnormal, if we can use that term, as the rest of us would. So not only has the rate of suicide among these returnees of these war fronts increased, but also domestic violence and the abuse of their spouses and children and extended family. And so therefore it becomes an epidemic of sorts. So yes, we have killed, just to put it a little bluntly, thousands of people overseas for their ideological beliefs or their nationalistic fervor, or for their religious fanaticism, or for their political extremism. However it's labeled, the end result of the conflict is that it amounts to violence and to killing, and in a way to devalue the human life, or life itself. So when life is then considered not as important, then it becomes more of a game. And therefore these actors are driven by symptoms of I think psychopathic behavior that affect a lot of people. Now, as an extension of that is also our over-militarized police. In the last 2 years at least, that the Black Lives Matter movement has been screaming across this nation in the parks and streets and rallies and demonstrations. One would think that just the mere fact that this word has become part of the active political vocabulary on the American political scene, that people would pay attention, but apparently not. And every day we hear that there is an involvement of the police or the sheriff, like the one we heard recently in Idaho, where a man was shot 12 times because his cow had been hit by an animal by a truck or a vehicle, and he was supposed to remove it. And we don't have to go to the details. Is that he was surrounded by sheriff officers, and They shot him 12 times. We have seen the cases, and of course, in many of these cases, the police are also supposedly equipped with cameras that are supposed to be on and filming when they come in contact with civilians, and somehow conveniently and magically these cameras get turned off when the crime against the civilians is committed. And I would attribute that to two factors. One, that the American police forces were over-militarized already. And now that the Pentagon is upgrading and they are sort of getting rid of certain of their military equipment, they are given to the police. And so the police become over-militarized too. On top of that, we have soldiers who return from the battle fronts in Afghanistan and Iraq, where for them it was sort of okay to kill the enemy, because once they were labeled, that legitimized their action. And so if they become so trigger happy in the battlefield abroad, that becomes part of their behavior pattern. When they come back home, they don't change, because, as I said earlier, it becomes normal for them to do so, to resort to violence. And so a lot of these soldiers get hired by the police departments because they have experience, war experience. They are tough. They are tested, they are trained, and so it makes the training part of the police easier. What we lose in the shuffle is that we forget that not only were these wars wrong when they were fought abroad, but they are also wrong when they are fought at home. That the color of the uniform may have changed from a military fatigue to a blue police uniform, but the mindset under which they operate, the violence that they perceive to be normal, the trigger-happy mindset that is the modus operandi in the minds of many of these officers, where they don't make any distinction as to whether their job is whether they are in a battlefield or on an American street. That distinction shouldn't be made as far as the violence against the human life is concerned. But even if we make that distinction just for the sake of argument, that our police force is becoming more and more militarized, and therefore there's more and more violence, and therefore we see more psychopathic behavior, and it's a part of that post-traumatic stress disorder, the PTSD, that doesn't get treated really, but gets channeled and diverted and redirected and, in essence, re-employed to unleash their wrath on civilians on the street, whether it's during a riot or any other kind of a clash among the police force and the citizens. So therefore, to go back to reconnect with the main concept of peace and war, it is not just the glorification of the war, which is based on nationalistic fervor, but then sometimes now it is relabeled as the concept of the law and order, which is what the police are supposed to be doing. But even in that law and order, there is a great deal of the victimization of the civilians. Let's take a short break and we'll be right back.